A calendar hangs on a kitchen wall in a quiet suburb just an hour outside of Tokyo. The page is turned to October, but the year is 1996. On the table, a ceramic tea set sits coated in a thick grey velvet of dust. In the hallway, a pair of leather shoes remains pointed toward the door, as if waiting for a master who stepped out for a moment and simply forgot to return. There are no signs of a struggle, no evidence of a hurried flight. There is only the heavy, suffocating weight of silence. Outside, the garden has long since breached the perimeter of the porch. Vines of kudzu crawl over the sliding glass doors, weaving a green shroud that slowly chokes the light from the rooms within. This house is not an anomaly. It is one of 8 million. Across the Japanese archipelago, a strange and quiet transformation is unfolding. It isn't happening with the violence of a natural disaster or the suddenness of a war. It is a slow, rhythmic vanishing. In the shadows of the world's most advanced neon metropolises, entire neighborhoods are falling asleep. They call them akiya, the ghost houses. They are the structural remains of a dream that flourished, peaked, and then began to wither away while the rest of the world wasn't looking. To walk through these streets is to walk through a living museum of the late 20th century, where the only thing moving is the wind rattling a loose shutter. But how did one of the most prosperous nations on Earth reach a point where millions of its homes are being reclaimed by the Earth, abandoned by a society that no longer has a place for them? To understand the haunting stillness of today, we have to look back to a time when these streets were drowning in noise. There was a window in history, following the devastation of the Second World War, when Japan was a construction site that never slept. The country was rising from the ashes with a ferocity that stunned the globe. By the 1960s and 70s, the economic miracle was in full swing. Cities like Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya were bursting at the seams. Thousands of people arrived every day from the countryside, seeking the stability of a corporate salary and the promise of a modern life. The government faced a crisis of space. The solution was the birth of the new towns, massive, ambitious suburban developments carved out of the hillsides and forests surrounding the major urban hubs. Imagine these neighborhoods in 1975. The air would have been thick with the scent of freshly sawn cedar and wet concrete. You would have heard the rhythmic shouting of children playing in the parks, the synchronized chime of thousands of doorbells as salarymen returned home on the evening trains, and the clatter of pans from kitchens where young mothers prepared dinner. These suburbs were the ultimate status symbol. Owning a piece of land with a yard, a modern Western-style toilet, and a dedicated parking space was the Japanese dream. It was a promise of permanence. Families took out 30-year mortgages, believing that the value of their land would only ever go up. They planted cherry blossoms in their front yards, expecting to watch their grandchildren play under them. For 2 decades, the momentum seemed unstoppable. The streets were vibrant, the schools were overcrowded, and the local shopping arcades were the beating hearts of the community. In these new towns, there was a sense of collective destiny. Everyone was roughly the same age, raising children of the same age, working toward the same goal of national prosperity. There was no reason to believe the music would ever stop, but as the 1980s arrived, the economy began to overheat into a speculative bubble, the likes of which the world had rarely seen. Land prices in Tokyo became so astronomical that the grounds of the Imperial Palace were theoretically worth more than the entire state of California. The frenzy pushed the suburban boundaries further and further out. People were buying homes in commuter towns that required 2 hours on a train just to reach the office. They were buying into the future, but the foundation was already beginning to crack. The first sign of the shift was subtle. It started with the silence of the playgrounds. As the initial wave of children grew up, they didn't see the suburbs as a dream, they saw them as a cage. The glittering lights of Shinjuku and Shibuya were calling. The younger generation didn't want the 2-hour commute or the maintenance of a wooden house in the hills. They wanted the convenience of high-rise apartments and the anonymity of the city. One by one, the bedrooms of the new towns emptied. The parents waved goodbye at the train stations, expecting their children to return one day to inherit the family home. But the return trips became less frequent. A visit for New Year's, a quick stay for Obon, and then, eventually, just a phone call. Then came the great collapse of the early 1990s. The bubble burst, and the legendary Japanese land prices plummeted. Almost overnight, the permanent wealth of the middle class evaporated. Those 30-year mortgages were suddenly attached to properties worth half of what was owed. The psychological blow was devastating. The era of relentless growth was over, replaced by what would become known as the lost decades. As the economy stagnated, the demographic clock began to tick louder. Japan was aging faster than any society in history. The birth rate began a long, slow slide downward, falling well below the level needed to replace the population. In the suburbs, the vibrant young mothers of the 1970s became the elderly widows of the 2000s. The shops in the arcades began to pull down their metal shutters for the last time. First, the toy store closed, then the bookstore, then the independent grocer. The local schools, once packed with rows of desks, found themselves with more empty classrooms than students. Eventually, they began to merge, and then they closed entirely. When a school dies, the heart of a neighborhood stops beating. Without the sound of bells and shouting children, the atmosphere changes. It becomes reflective, then somber, and finally eerie. The houses themselves began to follow the rhythm of their inhabitants. In Japan, houses are often treated like consumer electronics rather than assets. There is a deep-seated cultural preference for new builds, driven partly by evolving earthquake safety codes and partly by a historical legacy of wooden structures being frequently destroyed and rebuilt. Because of this, a house in Japan depreciates in value almost the moment it is finished. Within 20 to 30 years, the structure is often considered to worth nothing. Only the land holds value. This created a strange paradox. As the population shrank, developers continued to build brand new homes on the outskirts of cities because that is what the market demanded. Meanwhile, the existing homes in the older suburbs were left to rot. When the last owner of one of these suburban homes passes away, a complicated and often invisible tragedy begins. The children, now middle-aged and settled in Tokyo or Osaka, find themselves inheriting a property they don't want and can't sell. To sell the house, they would have to pay to demolish it, a cost that often exceeds the value of the land itself. To keep it, they must pay property taxes. In many cases, the paperwork is so convoluted, or the heirs so numerous and scattered, that the house is simply left in a legal limbo. The power is cut, the water is turned off, and the house begins its long descent into the earth. Walking down a street in a dying suburb is a haunting sensory experience. You pass 5 houses that are immaculately kept, with pruned bonsai and swept porches. Then you reach the 6th. The gate is rusted shut. The mailbox is stuffed with yellowed flyers from 5 years ago. A tricycle sits in the yard, its red paint faded to a ghostly pink by the sun, half buried in dry leaves. This is the IKEA creeping into the block. It is a contagion of neglect. Once one house goes, the property values of the neighbors drop. The incentive to maintain the area fades. It is the beginning of a ghost town, hidden in plain sight, just a few miles from the busiest train stations in the world. But the true mystery isn't just why people left, it's what they left behind, and what it says about a future that might be coming for us all. The air inside these homes is different. It is heavy, filtered through layers of stagnant dust, and the scent of damp tatami mat. When you step across the threshold of an abandoned IKEA, you aren't just entering a building, you are stepping into a paused moment in time. On the kitchen counters, calendars remain frozen on months from decades past. In the closets, silk kimonos hang neatly in plastic sleeves, waiting for a festival that will never come. There is an intimacy to these ruins that is deeply unsettling. Unlike the grand, stone ruins of ancient Rome or the industrial husks of the American Rust Belt, these are the ruins of the everyday. They are the remains of breakfast conversations, of homework finished by lamplight, of ordinary lives that simply evaporated. But the silence is deceptive. Beneath the stillness lies a complex web of economic and social forces that have made it nearly impossible to stop the rot. One of the most significant, yet least understood, reasons for this phenomenon is buried in the Japanese tax code. For decades, a specific policy meant that property taxes on land with a standing structure were significantly lower, sometimes as much as 6 times lower than taxes on vacant land. To a family living in a distant city, inheriting a grandfather's old house in the suburbs presented a grim financial choice. If they spent the thousands of dollars required to demolish the house and clear the land, their annual tax bill would skyrocket. If they left the house standing, even as a rotting, dangerous eyesore, the cost remained manageable, and so they chose the path of least resistance. They locked the door, walked away, and let the house become a ghost. This created a landscape of rotting teeth, single, crumbling houses wedged between well-kept homes, dragging down the spirit and the value of entire communities. But the legal hurdles go even deeper. In Japan, land ownership is often fractured among many heirs. If a patriarch died without a clear will, the ownership of the family home might be split between 5 children and then 10 grandchildren. To sell the property or tear it down, every single one of those heirs must agree. In a society where families have become increasingly disconnected and mobile, finding all those people and securing their signatures is often a logistical nightmare. Some heirs might live in Tokyo, others in New York, and some may have disappeared from the family records entirely. The result is a legal paralysis. The house cannot be touched, cannot be sold, and cannot be saved. It sits in a state of purgatory, waiting for a resolution that may never come. As the houses began to fail, the very fabric of suburban life began to fray. In the 1980s, the Shotengai, the traditional covered shopping arcades, were the social hubs of the Japanese suburbs. They were places where the butcher knew your name and the fishmonger knew your favorite cut. But as the population aged and moved away, these arcades transformed into what are now called shutter streets. One by one, the metal shutters came down and never went back up. The neon signs flickered out. The morning greetings were replaced by the hollow sound of footsteps echoing off the pavement. When a neighborhood loses its shops, it loses its reason for being. The elderly residents who remain find themselves living in food deserts, unable to walk to a grocery store, dependent on infrequent buses or the kindness of dwindling neighbors. The psychological toll on those who stay is profound. Imagine living on a street where half the houses are empty. Every night, you look out your window and see nothing but darkness where there used to be warm, glowing windows. You watch the vines slowly consume the house next door, knowing that the structural integrity of your own home is being threatened by the pests and the dampness emanating from the ruin. There is a sense of being left behind, as being a survivor in a world that is slowly disappearing. This isolation has given rise to one of the most tragic phenomena in modern Japan, kodokushi, or the lonely death. Every year, thousands of elderly people pass away in their suburban homes, unnoticed by the world. Because the social ties of the neighborhood have dissolved, it can be weeks or even months before anyone realizes they are gone. The ghost house is often created in the moment of a person's final, lonely breath. But why aren't these homes being bought by young families? In other parts of the world, a surplus of housing usually leads to a drop in prices and an influx of new buyers. But Japan is different. There is a deep-seated cultural stigma against used things, particularly homes. For many, a house is seen as having a soul, and a house that has been abandoned or where someone has died is often considered tainted or lonely. The idea of moving into someone else's old wooden house, with its outdated insulation and creaking floors, holds little appeal compared to the prestige of a brand new, modern build. Even as millions of homes sit empty, new suburban developments continue to be built on the fringes of cities, further hollowing out the older neighborhood. It is a cycle of construction and abandonment that defies conventional economic logic. This is the IKEA trap. The more houses that become abandoned, the less attractive the area becomes for investment. Banks are reluctant to provide mortgages for properties in declining suburbs. The infrastructure, the roads, the sewers, the water lines, becomes harder for the local government to maintain with a shrinking tax base. In some areas, the forest is literally reclaiming the suburbs. Wild boars and monkeys, once confined to the deep mountains, have begun to wander through the quiet streets of suburban Chiba and Ibaraki, reclaiming the territory that was taken from them during the boom years. The boundary between the human world and the wild is blurring. As you travel further from the metropolitan centers, the scale of the crisis becomes even more visible. In rural prefectures, there are villages where the average age is over 75. Here, the ghost towns aren't just neighborhoods, they are entire valleys. Schools that once echoed with the laughter of hundreds now house art installations or are used as storehouses for farming equipment. But even in these remote places, the ghost of the Japanese dream persists. You can still see the pride in the architecture, the beautiful tile roofs, the carefully placed garden stones. These were homes built with the expectation that they would be passed down through the generations, that they would be the bedrock of a family's legacy. To see them collapsing under the weight of heavy winter snow or being choked by summer weeds is to witness the slow-motion heartbreak of a nation. The government has finally begun to wake up to the magnitude of the problem. New laws have been passed to make it easier to identify owners and to strip away the tax incentives that kept these ruins standing. Some towns are even offering houses for free or for a symbolic price of $1 to anyone willing to move in and renovate them. They are trying to lure digital nomads and young families back to the suburbs with the promise of a quiet life and a massive amount of space. But for every success story, for every old farmhouse turned into a chic cafe, there are 1,000 more homes that continue to slide into oblivion. The momentum of the decline is so vast, so deeply rooted in the demographics of a shrinking population, that these efforts often feel like trying to hold back the tide with a plastic bucket. What we are seeing in Japan is not just a housing crisis. It is a preview of a future that many developed nations may eventually face. It is the story of what happens when the relentless engine of growth finally runs out of fuel. The ghost towns are a mirror, reflecting the reality of a society that is contracting rather than expanding. They force us to ask, what is the value of a home when there is no one left to live in it? What happens to a culture when its physical history is left to rot in the rain? The answers are written in the peeling wallpaper and the overgrown gardens of the 8 million empty homes. And as the sun sets over these quiet streets, the shadows of the houses grow long, reaching out toward the bustling cities, as if trying to remind the living of what they have forgotten. But the silence only deepened. Few people expected what would happen in the years that followed the first wave of abandonment. It wasn't just the houses that were changing, it was the very nature of Japanese society's relationship with the land. The suburbs, once the symbol of a bright, modernized future, were becoming something else entirely, a frontier of the forgotten. And in this frontier, a new and stranger mystery was beginning to take shape. One that would challenge everything the country believed about its own permanence. The forest does not wait for a legal deed. It does not care about property lines, zoning laws, or the unpaid taxes of a family that moved to Tokyo 20 years ago. In the suburbs of Japan, the forest is a patient predator. It begins with the cracks in the asphalt, where the first blades of grass push through the sun-baked surface. Then come the vines, reaching out from the mountain foothills to grip the telephone poles. Within a decade, a street that once hummed with the sound of morning commutes can be transformed into a green tunnel, where the houses are no longer distinct structures, but skeletal shapes hidden beneath a canopy of leaves. In some areas, the reclamation is so complete that hikers stumble upon entire neighborhoods they never knew existed, finding mailboxes and street signs standing like grave markers in the deep woods. This wilding of the suburbs has created a new kind of frontier, one where the boundaries between the human world and the animal kingdom are dissolving. In the quietest corners of these ghost towns, residents report seeing things that would have been unthinkable during the boom years. Wild boars roam through empty schoolyards. Monkeys sit on the roofs of abandoned convenience stores, watching the few remaining cars pass by with indifferent eyes. There are stories of bears wandering into suburban kitchens in search of food, lured by the silence of streets that no longer smell of people. It is a reversal of the 20th century narrative. Instead of humans carving cities out of the wilderness is slowly swallowing the cities whole. But what of the people who remain? In every dying suburb, there are the last guardians, the elderly residents who refuse to leave, even as their neighbors disappear one by one. Their lives are a testament to a vanishing way of life. They continue to sweep the streets in front of their homes, even if no one walks on them. They tend to the community shrines, lighting incense for gods who seem to have moved on. For them, the emptiness is a physical weight. They live in a world of ghosts, surrounded by the memories of a time when the air was full of voices. When asked why they stay, the answer is often a quiet reflection on duty and history. This is where they raised their children. This is where they work. To leave would be to admit that the life they built, the life the entire nation worked so hard to achieve, has reached its end. In a desperate attempt to stave off the total collapse of these communities, some local governments have turned to radical measures. They have created Akia Bank's online databases where abandoned homes are listed for prices that seem like a mistake. You can find a 2-story traditional house with a mountain view for the price of a used laptop. In some cases, the towns will even give the house away for free, provided the new owner stays for a decade and renovates the property. It is an invitation to a new generation to start over, to escape the cramped, expensive apartments of the city and find a different kind of freedom in the quiet. For a few, the lure of the ghost town is irresistible. There are young couples who have left their corporate jobs to turn rotting farmhouses into artisanal bakeries or remote co-working spaces. They see the ruins not as a tragedy, but as a blank canvas. They bring a flicker of life back to the streets, the sound of a hammer or the smell of fresh coffee breaking the heavy silence. But these pioneers are a drop in the ocean. For every house that is saved, 10,000 more continue to decay. The scale of the problem is simply too vast for individual effort to overcome. The IKEA are not just buildings, they are the physical manifestation of a demographic shift that is reshaping the very identity of the nation. Japan is often called the canary in the coal mine. Its shrinking population and the resulting ghost towns are a preview of a phenomenon that is beginning to touch other parts of the world. From the rural villages of Italy to the Rust Belt suburbs of the United States and the depopulating cities of South Korea, the symptoms are starting to appear. We have lived for centuries under the assumption that growth is the natural state of humanity, that populations will always rise, that cities will always expand, and that land will always increase in value. Japan is the first modern, developed nation to reach the edge of that assumption and look over into the abyss of contraction. It is showing us that the permanent structures of our civilization are far more fragile than we care to admit. What happens when a society stops growing? We are used to stories of collapse that involve fire, war, or sudden disaster. We are not prepared for a collapse that sounds like a clock ticking in an empty hallway. The ghost towns of Japan teach us that a culture doesn't always end with a bang. Sometimes, it simply fades away, house by house, street by street. The tragedy isn't found in the ruins themselves, but in the lost potential they represent. Every abandoned home was once a victory, a dream realized through decades of sacrifice. To see them standing empty is to see the collective memory of a generation being erased by the rain and the weeds. As you leave one of these suburbs and head back toward the neon glow of Tokyo, the transition is jarring. You move from the silence of the past into the frantic, high-speed energy of the future. The trains are packed, the skyscrapers are gleaming, and the streets are a river of light. It is easy to forget the ghost towns when you are standing in the middle of the world's largest city. But the ghost towns are not as far away as they seem. They are creeping closer every year, the circle of abandonment tightening around the urban centers. The same economic and social forces that emptied the distant hills are now beginning to touch the outskirts of the great metropolises. There is a Japanese concept called mono no aware, the pathos of things. It is a deep awareness of the transience of all things, a gentle sadness at the passing of time, and the beauty of that which is fleeting. Perhaps that is the only way to truly understand the 8 million empty homes. They are a reminder that nothing, not even the most prosperous and advanced civilization, is immune to the rhythm of the seasons. Buildings rise and they fall. People arrive and they depart. The dream of the 1970s suburb was a dream of permanence, but permanence is an illusion. In the end, the ghost towns aren't just a Japanese problem. They are a human story. They ask us what we value, what we leave behind, and how we will adapt when the world we built begins to shrink. They tell us that the things we take for granted, the sound of neighbors, the light in the window, the safety of a community, are gifts that require constant care. Without that care, without the people to sustain them, even the strongest walls will eventually crumble. As the sun dips below the horizon, casting long skeletal shadows across a deserted street in a suburban new town, the first lights begin to flicker on in the houses that are still inhabited. But for every light that shines, there are 5 more that stay dark. In those dark rooms, the dust continues to settle on the tea sets and the calendars. The vines continue their slow climb up the walls. The silence remains unbroken. Japan's suburbs are not just turning into ghost towns, they are becoming monuments to a version of the future that didn't quite last. And as the night deepens, the only sound left is the wind, moving through the open doors of 8 million empty homes, whispering a story that the rest of the world is only just beginning to hear.